Do more within your family, your friends, your community, with a charity, maybe volunteering, or doing more to achieve something that can make a difference in the world that we live in. Enjoy this special gift from the OWA. We'd like to thank ABB Optical again for sponsoring this event, and many thanks to the Vision Council and to Vision Expo, who graciously assist us each and every year with our events. Speaking of doing more, I would like to invite Nan Meehan from ABB Optical. She's the VP of Eyewear and Vice Co-Chair of our new member subcommittee here at the OWA. Please welcome Nan Meehan.
Thank you, Tiara. And the rest of you ladies that are here, we are going to do more, aren't we? Right? That's what it's all about. And you brave gentlemen that are here, raise your hand. Where are they? Yes, you are going to do more, and you're going to help us do more. So I just want to thank the OWA for the opportunity that we've had in working together. And as the vice chair of the new membership, each one of you, I'm going to ask you to try to reach out while you're here for the next 3 days. Many are staying for the weekend, even 4 days. Try to invite one person to the OWA. Once you're here, you're completely inspired, which is what happened with us. So Tiara brought me in, some of the other folks that are here. I am just loving being part of this organization, and it's so important for what we do. And that Do More campaign and that Instagram, jump on there, it's pretty cool. So thank you for allowing us to be a part of it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Erinn Morgan. Erinn joined the OWA Board of Directors in March and is the chair of our Communications Committee and the editor-in-chief and editorial director at Eyecare Business magazine. Please welcome Erinn Morgan.
And joining us today is the amazing Joann Lublin. We are very fortunate to have her here today. I'm sure you've all seen her book by now, floating around here, but I have read it from cover to cover and really, really enjoyed the book. I have got it marked up and dog-eared, and it's a keeper for sure. And there's so many good tips and inspiration in there. So thank you for writing such a fantastic book for women. I really appreciate it. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on Joann, and then we are going to play this very cool video that was produced by the Wall Street Journal about Joann. So she is a longtime career columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Her advice column called Your Executive Career appears regularly, and that still is appearing.
The last one was just the end of last week. It was about how executives are getting much juicier relocation packages.
Cool. So if we go Google, we can find all of that good stuff. Your Executive Career on the Wall Street Journal. So until recently, she was also the journal's management news editor. She worked with reporters to conceptualize and organize coverage of management and workplace issues. She covered corporate governance, executive pay, management recruiting, and succession. Her stories on these topics mainly appeared on the front page and business and tech sections of the Wall Street Journal. Sorry about that. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, better.
Oh, that's better.
Sorry about that. So she is obviously also the author of Earning It, Hard-Won Lessons from Trailblazing Women at the Top of the Business World. So the book was published in 2016, and it reflects interviews with 52 high-level executives, women, most of whom are experienced public company CEOs. In 2018, just this year, very, very exciting, Joann won the Lifetime Achievement Award given annually by the Gerald Loeb Awards, the highest honor in business journalism. Congratulations, Joann. She was also a Loeb finalist in 2007. In 2003, she was a member of a journal team, Wall Street Journal team, given the Pulitzer-prize for stories exposing corporate scandals. What an amazing career, and we are so fortunate to have you here. So Joann, before we get started, we just wanted to share this very cool video that was produced by the Wall Street Journal. And Courtney, if you could just cue it for us.
My first journal front page story was overshadowed by the Apollo 11 moon launch. It became my own small step on a long journey of perseverance. For example, at the end of my first journalism job, my boss gave me the parting gift of an unwelcome kiss. I became even more determined to prove myself in a male-dominated industry. But the journey wasn't easy. In the journal's Washington Bureau, I had to work diligently while raising 2 children. At times, I came close to giving up journalism, but I decided things might improve with persistence. So I remained resolute and worked my way into a management role at the journal's first women-run bureau in London. I returned to the U.S. to cover national issues. All that hard work paid off. I've met countless titans of industry. I've rippled through David Rockefeller's legendary Rolodex cards and ridden in a choppy helicopter piloted by a CEO. In 2003, I shared the journal's Pulitzer for stories on corporate scandals like WorldCom. A colleague and I broke the story of Steve Jobs' liver transplant, one of many exclusives I achieved through teamwork. Through it all, I've championed women's advancement in the newsroom and seen great progress in America's workforce. But much remains to be done. Only 64 women have ever run a Fortune 500 firm, and just 3 have been succeeded by another woman. Occasionally, I'm still mistaken for a subscription saleswoman when I call sources. But persistence will one day change that too. As I've told many women, keep working toward a goal you know you can achieve. It just might lead to the story I write about you. My name is Joann Lublin, and I'm the management news editor for the Wall Street Journal.
That's a great, great video. So I pulled some statistics from the book that I thought were very telling. Joann had an incredible amount of resources in terms of stats and came from studies and different research sources. So this just kind of shows the path. So in the years following World War II, less than 1/3 of U.S. women held jobs or even sought work outside the home. In 2013, women earned 78 cents for every dollar that men earned, up from 72 cents in 1990 and 60 cents in 1980.
In 2018, it's 81 cents.
All right, well, we're making progress. Maybe not quite. We'll get there.
She's not happy about that.
And then in 2014, women represented nearly 39% of U.S. managers, and in 2013, just 14.6% of executive officer positions at Fortune 500 companies, and that is from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. And then businesses with the most gender-diverse leadership were also 15% more likely to generate earnings before interest tax that outpaced industry. So obviously, having women in leadership positions is very positive for a business's growth. Same type of thing here, though. Nearly 2/3 of Americans believe women continue to face a barrier to career advancement, which that much is clear from all of these statistics. So we wanted to just kind of set the stage there with those, and then if we can move on to this slide. So I just wanted to kind of clarify even further the focus of the book, and this is such a great kind of quote from Joann from the book. The executive women whose stories I tell in this book represent a unique elite that has radically reshaped the business landscape in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. They dismantled the old boys club, destroyed myths about capabilities of female leaders, and continue to serve as role models for female associates. Earning It is filled with candid and compelling stories about workplace experiences and advancement advice from 52 corporate female leaders. I can't tell you how many great stories there are in this book. If you haven't read it yet, I would highly recommend it. There are so many great strategies to take away. It's just it's a very fun read. It moves along at a good pace. So we'll do a kind of a Q&A with Joann here, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So if you want to be thinking about anything you want to ask along the way, and we have some fun giveaways for people at the end here as well. So the first question that I'd like to ask you, Joann, the book, how it came about. So what was your inspiration? How did it get started? Obviously your column and the things you've worked on.
Are we going to share the mic?
I think so.
It'll make it a little hard to have Q&A from the audience if we have one mic to share.
They have one.
Oh, we have one. All right.
Okay, good.
Maybe we can have more than one here. In any case, while our other half is equipping my Hollywood mic, the idea for the book grew out of a first-person essay that I wrote a decade ago for a then Wall Street Journal blog called Journal of Women. And the essay was called Remember the Barriers. And I wrote this essay in order to help our daughter Abra, who you'll meet in the book, as she entered the workforce. I wanted her to understand that as much as things had gotten better since I had joined the workforce in the 70s, that things were not, as I like to say, hunky-dory yet for women. And that just as I had stood on the shoulders of women who had blazed trails before me, I wanted her to continue to do the same and have women that came into the workforce after her stand on her shoulders. But in this essay, I wrote about how difficult it was to be taken seriously as a journalist because I was a woman. And the example that you saw in the little animated video about being mistaken for an ad salesperson still happens today. I mean, it happened this spring, but it happened with much greater degree of regularity when I was first starting out at the Journal. And I got so much reaction to this piece because of these various ways in which I was both slighted and discriminated against for being a female, that I wondered if there was a book. And because I've been writing about management issues for a long time and had met a few, but not very many, impressive executive women, I decided to do a book about women who also had encountered gender bias and had nevertheless succeeded. And as I reported the book, it became clear that that wasn't the only reason that they were successful. What made them successful was how they coped with setbacks, personal and professional, whether they related to their gender or not. And what did they do in the face of such setbacks that made them better leaders? So it ended up being a leadership book rather than a book simply for women, and is therefore one that I think men get a lot out of as well as women. Sorry about the long answer.
No, we love the long answers, and that's very insightful too, that the takeaways are there for men as well, for sure. Yes, and so many great stories in here, and it's just an incredible wealth of information and lots of great tips. So we'll get more specifically to that in questions as we go along here. But my next question is, if you had to pick one thing, there's so many takeaways from the book, but if you had to pick the most important thing you'd like people to take away?
Well, I think it's very, very important at the end of the day, even if you have a lot of people rooting for you, you've got to be your best fan. You have to believe in yourself, you have to believe in what you've achieved, and you have to believe in what you think you have the potential to achieve.
That's great. So definitely believe in yourself. Wonderful.
Because mom won't always be around to do that for you.
So, and then the next slide we have some of the tips. I really love chapter 3. I mean, obviously, many of us are further along in our careers, but it was really some great early career leadership lessons in chapter 3, going through some of these. I mean, there's many more than these, but these are just some of the ones I pulled out. Be tenacious, find influential internal allies, confront self-doubts about your capabilities, that's believing in yourself. Be willing to start at the bottom, aim for early jobs that measure success quantitatively. So there may be women here who are, new to the industry or new to their jobs. What do you recommend? What are some of the more on this kind of chapter tips for early career?
Well, I think the most critical one on that list is this notion of finding internal allies. And your internal allies don't necessarily only have to be where you work. And that's why it's really important for everyone in this room to enlist other members of the OWA. Because a really great way to get ahead professionally is by professionally networking. And not only does that then expose you to a larger group of people, but you make incredible contacts. I once wrote a career column for the Wall Street Journal about unusual ways in which you can find new networking sources. And so one of the things I suggested that people do is, let's say, for some strange reason, you decide to leave the optical industry and you want to break into the trucking industry. Well, you don't know anyone in the trucking industry. But you go online and discover that in your town or the town next to yours, there is a convention coming up of HR executives in the trucking industry. Get yourself a ticket. Go to the conference and meet the people who do the hiring for the trucking industry. So you got to think out of the box when you're looking to forge important allies.
That's great. And certainly networking, and the OWA does a lot of networking events
Absolutely.
and regional networking events, and those are so important. So if you have the opportunity to attend anything like that, it's really, really valuable. So that's great. We are live streaming on Facebook, so yes, we're all set up here. Okay, so on the next slide, so we'll move on to some of our additional questions. Obviously, in the moment, in the day today, this is so relevant and such a topical issue. So a 2011 poll found that 1 in 4 women has experienced sexual harassment in the workplace, and 64% of both genders still viewed it as a problem. It's obviously a sensitive subject, but it is a topical issue. What are some of the key takeaways from your book and tips on dealing with this in the workplace?
Well, Erinn keeps referring to takeaways, and I want everyone in the audience to know, if you're really stressed out and don't have time to read every pearl of wisdom in my book, there are 6 or 8 bullets at the end of each core chapter that are just this: relevant lessons or strategies that have to do with the topic. These particular ones come, that I'm sharing with you, from the end of the chapter on sexual harassment. And I'm going to share with you a couple of those and then tell you how I got pushback about at least one of those. I think at the end of the day, if you believe you are the victim of sexual harassment on the job, what's important is to seek justice and not just revenge. And by that I mean look for a way to deal with the problem that will have universal application and will not simply fix it for your own situation, or else it's going to happen again and again. And what was so remarkable about a number of these women I interviewed was they just chose to cooperate because they wanted to return it, because they had been victims of sexual harassment, and they chose when they got to be bosses, executive women, that they would not tolerate this, that they would go above and beyond whatever the corporate policy was, and they would make sure that the bad guys got punished. Which was another tip I had at the end of that chapter, which is, if you believe you are being victimized and sexually harassed at work, you should look for help from a senior level executive woman. And I cite an example of a woman who, at the time I interviewed, was the CEO, had been sexually harassed in her 20s, and discovered that one of her 20-something saleswomen was being berated by a client who wanted her to go out with him. And she kept saying no, and he kept texting her and doing, not such nice things. And she didn't know what to do because this is a small startup. She was afraid they would lose the client. And so the woman went to her boss, and the boss brought her to the CEO. And the CEO said to this young woman, "Are you involved with a romantic relationship?" The young woman said yes. And so the CEO said to her, "Tell the corporate client that you're involved in a relationship, and if that doesn't get him off your back, I'm willing to give up the account." The other piece of advice, and the one that got me in trouble, was suggesting that to the extent it's possible, you avoid putting yourself in potentially dangerous situations, like going to a corporate dinner that involves heavy drinking and it's late at night, and you know you're going to be the only woman there. When I was interviewed by an NPR affiliate right after the book came out, the reporter involved said to me, "I noticed that several of your tips at the end of this chapter relate to what women can do to either avoid being sexually harassed or to deal with it once it's happened to them." And she said, "How long will it be before the onus is no longer only on women? When will the onus be on men as well?" And I had to sit up in my chair and thought, oh shit, should have covered that. But I didn't say that. I simply swallowed my pride and said, I believe in our lifetime, because I've met a lot of really dedicated men who care very deeply that women be treated as human beings and not as sex objects, that men will take the onus on them. But just as a little afterthought, you saw in the beginning of this little video about the fact that I had, at the beginning of my journalism career, been the subject of an unwanted kiss from a boss. Well, the corporate people, in editing this, made me take out the fact that it was my boss at the end of my first summer internship at the Wall Street Journal who did that.
And how did that situation get resolved?
Well, in light of what's going on today, it's very germane, okay? Because I obviously have post-traumatic stress disorder. I totally blocked it out of my mind. I mean, the guy walked me down the hall, my last day as a summer intern, no windows, no people around, leaned down, kissed me on the lips, and walked away. And I just, in the moment, what flashed through my head, I am sure, was, I can't tell anyone, I'll never get hired by the Wall Street Journal when I get out of college. I was a college student. Fast forward to the Clarence Thomas hearings, okay? I'm now a Wall Street Journal reporter. I'm in the Washington Bureau, and I'm helping to cover the hearings. And in the middle of those hearings, just like we're all having deja vu watching these hearings today, I had this flashback, the fact I'd been kissed on the lips by the guy who was my boss in that summer internship, and I had totally forgotten about him, and I started shaking all over. And when I was reading the testimony of this victim of our latest Supreme Court nominee, I was getting the shakes again this morning. I mean, that anyone who has ever been sexually harassed is going to relive it and relive it. And right after the book came out, I did an event hosted by a law firm in which they focused very heavily on this aspect of the book. And there were 110 people in the room, of whom 105 were women. And they asked, how many women in this room have ever been subject to sexual harassment? And 70% of the women raised their hands. And I was blown away.
So maybe 1 in 4 is, a conservative estimate on this stat. And that was 2011, so. Yes, well, it's a very emotional topic, and thank you for dealing with that, in such an honest way. So we appreciate that information. So we had talked about this a little bit before in the statistics that I went over, but studies show that women often make less than their male counterparts on the job, and it's pretty universal. In 2014, this was another statistic from the book, there was a $10,000 difference in average salaries for male and female executives, and this was chapter 5, where you did closing the pay gap there.
And so what would you say are some of the best, there were some great, very proactive tips in that chapter.
I think just to bring that figure up to date, there is something called the Institute for Women's Policy Research, which every year comes out with an analysis of what the current pay gap is. Their 2018 report, which reflects 2017 data, was issued September 12th, so that's 15 days ago. The gap, as I said just at the outset, was about 81 cents on the dollar. And every year they update what year it will be before women and men achieve parity in the pay arena. So this latest report that came out 2 weeks ago said it will be 2059 before those of us who are women in the room will be making $1 every time a man makes $1. So among the tips at the end of the chapter on the gender pay gap, I talk about the importance of what I call the velvet glove in pay negotiations. And the idea of the velvet glove is that you go into these conversations, whether it's when you're being hired or being promoted, and you speak from a position of knowledge. It's not just that you've done research as to how much the person whose job you're looking to take is making, but you have found out what men and women in comparable jobs elsewhere in that company, but maybe not the identical job, are making. You've looked at what the rates are within your industry. If it's an executive level position, you've reached out perhaps to have a lawyer negotiate on your behalf. You've gone to an executive pay consultant who normally would charge a lot of money for this kind of secret information, but sees you're about to be promoted or hired as an executive and wants to get on your good side and will give you really good competitive information. So you're basically going in very well prepared. But the velvet part of the glove is that you, again, use your empathy skills. You work on this negotiation by being able to see where this person on the other side of the table is coming from. And you operate from a position of strength about what you're worth, but you also operate from a position of empathy and understanding where he or she is coming from. The other point is, I think that you need to be willing to jump ship if you're not getting the pay you deserve. And there were several women who I interviewed for the book who said when men didn't get what they thought they deserved for either their current job or the next job they wanted, they went and got paid better somewhere else. And I saw this happen time and time again at the Wall Street Journal. Someone would get a counter offer, the New York Times was sniffing at their heels, and the Journal didn't want to lose that person, and all of a sudden the money that wasn't there was there to keep them. Or the title, or both. Now, I do remember the Journal drawing a line when a woman did want to have an employment contract, and she was only a reporter, and all kinds of other things, and they said, you want to go work for the Financial Times? Bye. And she did.
That's great. Well, thank you for those insights. It's definitely an area where there is a lot of improvement to be made, for sure. So, and I had mentioned to you earlier, I really enjoyed the stories and the feedback from the one executive, Carol Bartz, and she was Yahoo and Autodesk. She was one of my favorites, my personal favorites in the book. But, you know, the next question is just, what is the most surprising or inspiring insight you learned from the women you interviewed, and if there's any particular woman or story that is very inspiring?
Well, it's ironic that, Erinn, you should bring up Carol Bartz, because one of the things I discovered early on in reporting the book was that many of these women I was interviewing were tall. And so after a while, I started asking them, how tall are you, and putting it in my notes. And when I asked Carol Bartz that question, her first answer was, well, before or after I started shrinking. And I said before. In any case, at the end of the day, there were more than a dozen women I interviewed who stood 5'7" or taller. The tallest woman was 6 feet tall. She was then the CEO of Popeye's Louisiana Kitchen. And one of these women who was 5'7" always wore 3-inch heels. And so I asked her, and you'll read this in the book, you're already plenty tall. I mean, the average American woman is 5'4", which I am. Why did you have to wear the 3-inch heels? And she said, Joann, when I got onto the senior management team for the first time, I was the only woman on the team, and I decided if I was going to be dealing with the guys, I needed to be able to look them straight in the eye. So she did. The other really amazing thing I found about the women I interviewed was that more than 80% of these 52 women are moms, they're manager moms, and among those who became public company chief executives, the percentage is even higher. Now, in answer to your other question, Carol Bartz, of course, is a character and has plenty of stories in her own life. But I think my two most memorable women that I met were Diane Bryant, who at the point when I interviewed her was a senior executive at Intel. Subsequent to, after the book came out, became the highest ranking woman at Intel, left Intel, went to work for Google, and left Google about a month ago and is widely rumored, but it's not confirmed, going to be the next CEO of Intel. But I don't know if that is true. In Diane's case, her father was a convicted criminal. He had spent time at San Quentin before she was born. He physically abused her mother, who was a stay-at-home mom, and her mother periodically would leave her father, who was abusive, take Diane and her sister, and try and escape what was clearly a very unhealthy home situation. And her mother always had to go back, because she had no source of outside income. And so even as a young girl, Diane said to herself, I will never be financially dependent on another human being when I'm an adult. And unfortunately for her, she got to find that out at a very young age. On the day she turned 18, she was in high school, drove home in the little Volkswagen she had bought with her own money, and standing on the front lawn was her dad, surrounded by all her worldly goods, and her mother was on the porch sobbing. Diane had forgotten that when her older sister turned 18, her father had turned her out of the house because he felt that his legal obligation to support her was at an end. He said to her, whatever you can fit in the Volkswagen is yours, and the rest is mine. That meant the 10-speed that she had also saved up a lot of money for didn't go with her. She ended up staying with friends for a couple months till she graduated, got her own place, got 2 jobs so she could go to junior college, and while she was in a calculus class, a boy in the class said to her, you know what? You ought to get a 4-year degree and become an engineer, because you could make $30,000 a year. Wow! Diane Bryant thought that sounded like a lot of money. So she goes to the career services office to say, okay, I plan to get a 4-year degree and become an engineer. The career services person says to her, well, do you want to be a software engineer or a hardware engineer? She hadn't the foggiest idea what she was talking about. I mean, this was a woman who nobody thought would go to college. She liked to do people's hair when she was in college. Everyone thought she was going to become a hairdresser. And so Diane said, well, software sounded more feminine. So I said, software. She gets out of college, gets hired by Intel as a software engineer, is $30,000 a year, and you keep an eye on her because this woman may well be the next CEO of Intel. The second most impressive, or at least memorable story to me, involved another woman ended up in the tech world, a woman named Dawn Lepore, who in 2010 had become a public company CEO. She was running something called drugstore.com, an online retailer. She was a very busy lady at that point. She had a daughter in kindergarten, a son in 3rd grade. She was on 2 corporate boards, one of which was the New York Times. And her husband lay dying in the hospital. He had multiple myeloma and had a bone marrow transplant. And she was spending every day going to work and every night lying next to, but not touching her husband in the hospital. All her friends, well-meaning friends, criticized her. how could she do this? How could she work full-time, be on boards, have a husband who is dying in the hospital, and 2 little kids? Oh, and in the middle of all this, her housekeeper, who she relied on for childcare, was stealing money from her. And she was totally devastated by this. And so she said to her husband, I can't do this. I'm just going to quit everything. I'm going to give up my boards. I'm going to resign as CEO. And he turned to her and said, if you quit, then the cancer will have won. And so because he asked her not to quit, she didn't. And he did recover, and she did live to tell this tale to me. But she was so resilient. I mean, the day I interviewed her for the book, her arm was in a cast. She had broken her wrist like the day after her mother's funeral, which was like 2 weeks before this, and she still got on a plane and flew to the East Coast to do the interview with me. That was what was so amazing about so many of these women. In the face of what the worst that life can deal them in the way of cards, they thought about how they were going to overcome that obstacle and how they were going to become a better human being and a better leader. A couple of the women got laid off earlier, midway through their careers. It made them better leaders. Sorry to go on.
No, I love these stories, and I remember reading them in the book, and the woman who, with the father and the, everything on the front lawn, I mean, it was just so incredible, that story. And it seems to me that these women just had also such resilience and perseverance,
Absolutely.
kept going. They just kind of kept plowing through everything as they needed to keep going. And this isn't a question that I put on here, so if, we can kind of work around it, but it just reminded me of how, and the chapter on work-life balance was so, helpful. And, I'm a working mom, I travel a lot, my husband, works, he travels a lot, it's such a balance. So, and these women had, it's like the story of the woman with her husband and the 2 little kids, and, how do you ever balance that? That's like an impossible situation. But in a day-to-day scenario, is there any tip that comes to mind that, because all of us have work-life balance, right? We all have families and husbands and kids and whatnot. And I'm sorry to throw an unexpected question.
Oh my gosh. Do you think I've ever been asked that question? The relevant chapter title sums it all up. And it's a quote from one of these women. Okay? And the title of the chapter is, Manager Moms Are Not Acrobats. Hello? There is no such thing as balance, unless you are an acrobat, which then it probably is important. And the point of the chapter is to be there in the moment. You have to be 110% of yourself at work, and you probably have to be 120% of yourself at home. And so when I was reporting the book, my daughter-in-law, who at that point had 2 little kids, now has 3, said, please, for these little tips you're putting at the end of your chapter, get some practical advice. I promise, okay. So one of the pieces of advice at the end of Manager Moms Are Not Acrobats was something that the CEO of Buffalo Wild Wings gave me to take back to my daughter-in-law, which was, buy extra underwear and you won't have to do the wash so often. I also know working moms who lay out their wardrobe a week in advance, including down to the accessories, okay? So they hang the earrings and the scarf on the hanger with the clothing. I think that's a little bit OCD, but whatever works.
Those are some great tips. I'm going to for sure go out and get some extra, because even for my child, just that extra laundry so often. It's good stuff.
And that CEO, by the way, was a woman who was in mid-level career when she had 2 little kids, One day gets to the office and looks down, she's wearing a black shoe and a brown shoe. Another day she gets to the office and can't figure out why she can't see very well. Both contacts are in one eye. I mean, we all had the spit up on our jackets, but those were ones I hadn't heard.
Thank you for that. So on the next slide are just a few more questions, and I think we're doing okay on time. We have about maybe 10 more minutes. So, and you've shared just a few of the executive stories. So this was, I don't know if there were others that you prepared that you wanted to share. But
well, I do want to share the Carol Barnes story, okay? Who, as we all remember, wanted to know what height I wanted to ask her about. This is a woman who, when she becomes a public company chief executive for the first time at Autodesk, is diagnosed with breast cancer within weeks of getting into the job. Now, as the head of a publicly traded company, you kind of have a legal obligation to let the world know if you've got a health issue. So at her very first news conference, which happens at a tech industry show, one just like Vision Expo, she announces that she's been diagnosed with breast cancer and will be going into the hospital the next morning. There are no questions. She asks if there are any questions. Finally, a young man in the back of the room raises his hand. What do you think his question was? Come on, shout it out. She explains, that she has been diagnosed with breast cancer. When are you coming back would be a reasonable question. Another reasonable question would be, who's going to run the company while you're recovering from your surgery? His question is, which breast? Now, Carol Barnes is someone who never minces words, and in fact got fired from her subsequent job at Yahoo in part because she likes to use 4-letter words. So when she tells me this story, I said to her, wow, I hope you came back with a great repartee like, and have your nuts been operated on recently? Or something to that effect. But she said, Joann, I was so stunned, I just said next question or something to that effect. She did not make it come back. But it would have been in keeping with Carol Barnes for her to throw something back again. But luckily her upper hand got the upper hand. And she was a public company. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. That was a great story. Thank you for sharing that.
And a lot of these stories are not in the books.
So we got some extra.
We got some.
So we've all probably at one time or another dealt with a difficult boss or a difficult coworker, and it can certainly make the workplace and the work environment and the culture there very, very unpleasant. But you do have some really great tips in the book for dealing with a difficult boss, and that's something that could apply to a man or a woman, for sure.
Being a bad boss knows no gender. So everyone in this room has had bad bosses, irrespective of their gender. What was interesting, though, in the case of several of these women that I met, and of course of writing this book, is that they actually became better bosses for having had jerk bosses. In fact, one woman actually put together a little notebook in which she wrote down every time the guy did something really stupid, so that she could remember, if she ever got to be a boss, and she wasn't at this point, what not to do. The other thing that I think at least one of these women learned from working for a bad boss was it gave her actually a greater degree of confidence in her own ability to be a boss. Remember the woman who wore the 3-inch heels so she could look the guys in the eye? Well, earlier in her career, her boss was being promoted. He urged her to apply for his job. She needed to know, 10 things. She knew how to do 4 of them. This is the classic, well, if I only know how to do 4, I can't raise my hand. So the guy who also only knew how to do 4, who was a peer, got the job. He was terrible. He came late, left early, and couldn't supervise his way out of a paper bag, and lasted less than a year. And when he got fired, and she hated working for him, she went back to her now promoted old boss and said, I really think I'm qualified for that job, And he said, yeah, I wondered why you hadn't applied before. Well, it took this experience of working for a complete and utter idiot to make her realize that she was actually smarter than she thought she was, and just as good as he was, if not better. And she was very successful in that job.
Thank you for that. Great answer. And so the last question I have up here, and it just reminded me of the very ending of your book. You talk about talking to your granddaughter, and she was 4 in 2016, so she 6 or 7?
She just turned 7.
Okay.
And my granddaughter, God bless her, lives in Minneapolis. And of course, I try to get a lot of book appearances there. And so the day I was heading to Target headquarters, I come to breakfast, and Isabel said, Nana Jo, because I said, I'm going over to Target today. You're wearing Target colors. I was wearing red. How would you know what Target colors are? Well, because Mommy takes me to Target.
That's so cute. She might be in marketing, yeah.
It went over real big at Target.
But in the book, I remember, it was such a great conversation you had with her where she said she wanted to be, I can't remember, a doctor and this and then a bus driver was one of her things. And you said you had told her that women weren't, previously were not allowed to drive buses.
That's right.
And she said, why? Like there was no, and that's how my daughter is too, there's no concept of the limitations, so which is so awesome to have. And, so if you were starting your career again today, or if you were giving her advice, what would you say to her or to yourself?
Well, it's very funny you should ask that question, because on the eve of my retirement from full-time work, the then deputy editor-in-chief and now editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal asked me to write this very essay. And you can go online and read it. It appeared April 27th, and the essay is entitled Letter to My Younger Self. And it was basically advice that I wish I had had when I was 22 and straight out of grad school and joining the Wall Street Journal. Because I didn't know what I didn't know. And how are we supposed to know what we don't know? And the Wall Street Journal, because I also pay for my subscription, sends me a reminder once a month about articles you should read that would be useful to you. So I got my latest reminder day before yesterday, and there's my essay. Right? Item number 4 out of 10. But there were like 4 main things that I talked about in that essay. And one of them was to understand the unwritten rules of the workplace. Everybody's got corporate policies, but guess what? They often get circumvented. They often get broken. And you have to know what they are. The second thing I put in that essay was find the door to the old boys club. Because at the end of the day, women are still in the minority in senior management, and it's the men who rule the roost. So you need to find out what it takes to be admitted to the old boys club. In my case, it required learning how to play bridge, because the guys in the office in Chicago, at the end of the day when things slow down, played bridge. But it also meant, I found out when I was writing this essay, that the guys in that office got invited to the male bureau chief's house for drinks after work that I never was invited to. And a subsequent woman in that bureau got wind of it, and then it changed. The third thing I said in that essay was you need to deliberate before making critical career decisions. Someone offers you that really incredible promotion that you're positive you would never be able to do. Don't reject it in the moment. Take some time. Don't act on an impulse, because you'll regret it. And you haven't done your homework, obviously. And my last tip in that essay was to remember the power of tact, because I have been guilty of what I call foot-in-mouth disease. I have acted before thinking about the consequences of my action. And again, it came from a lack of sophistication, and in the case of my own employer, the fact that they were always slow to do the supervisory training, generally 5 to 10 years after you moved into management. not 5 to 10 years before they got to me. So those are my 4 tips.
That's great. So if we want to go on and read that, we can
You
just
can
Google.
just Google Letter to My Younger Self, Joann Lublin, April 27th.
Awesome. Very, very cool. Well, thank you for answering all of my questions. And now I am going to